Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be discussing the second half check-in. Where does Congress go from here? I'm Sean Zeller, editor for CQ Magazine and host of CQ Roll Call's CQ on Congress podcast. We're now doing the podcast 5 days a week, and our three reporter guests on today's webinar regularly share their insights on the podcast. So please tune in. You can find it for free at rollcall.com or on any of the major podcast apps. Jennifer Shutt, our budget and appropriations reporter, is also a regular host of the CQ Budget podcast, which publishes weekly. And you'll also find our political theater show at rollcall.com. So just a plug for those where you can get additional insights for free. FiscalNote and our team of reporters and editors at CQ Roll Call are actively monitoring the coronavirus outbreak and the effects it is having on our politics, policy, and on customers and the industries they serve. To see the most up-to-date and comprehensive monitoring of the virus and how governments in the United States and Europe are responding, visit coronavirus.fiscalnote.com. We've made much of our coverage available there free of charge to help you navigate through this crisis. You can also sign up for our daily newsletter and learn more about how FiscalNote can help your organization monitor the politics and policy around COVID-19. Again, if you're interested, please check out coronavirus.fiscalnote.com. I've got just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. You'll see a Q&A box and a chat box on your screen. You can use them to submit questions during the webinar. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. We'll try to get to as many as possible during our hour together. We're recording this session, so afterwards, you'll be sent a copy of this event. Everyone should be muted upon entry, but if you're not, with the exception of our panelists and for the benefit of our audience, please ensure your microphone is on mute. Today, I'm joined by three of our newsroom experts who will help guide the conversation and share their unique insights. They will also answer your questions. First, we've got Niels Lesniewski. He's the chief correspondent for the White House and Congress for CQ Roll Call. Prior to this role, Niels served as senior staff writer and editor of CQ Senate Watch. Jennifer Shutt is currently a budget and appropriations reporter for CQ Roll Call, focusing on the president's budget request, budget resolutions, appropriations bills, continuing resolutions, debt limit legislation, and the Budget Control Act spending caps. Prior to joining CQ Roll Call, Jennifer worked as a web producer at Politico. Mary Ellen McIntyre is a reporter for healthcare policy for CQ Roll Call. Prior to joining CQ, Mary Ellen worked at Morning Consult as a reporter covering healthcare policy from Capitol Hill, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I'm going to kick things off with a short briefing on the state of legislating in the House. Then I'll go to Niels on the Senate, Jennifer, who will talk about the prospects for a fifth virus rescue bill, and then Mary Ellen for a health report, a report on healthcare and how the administration is combating the virus. On the House is back this week. It's the first time they'll be in session for 2 days in a row since March, since they left, since the country shut down. They've been back a number of times to take votes on rescue bills, but this time around they'll be back and hoping to get back to a sense of more normalcy. And that's because they now have in place a plan to use proxy voting. They passed a rule change on May 15th that allows members to come to the floor and vote for themselves as well as for up to 10 others. And they'll use this new power this week to vote first on a FISA bill, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act reauthorization that's been batting around between the House and Senate since earlier this year. The House passed a version early in the year. The Senate last week passed a version, but it amended it. And so it's gone back to the House where it will be voted on again. This could get interesting because President Trump tweeted this week that he wants Republicans to vote against the bill. And there are a number of civil libertarians on both sides of the aisle who oppose the bill. It would update certain authorizations for our intelligence agencies to look at business records in anti-terrorism investigations. The House will also vote on a fix to the Paycheck Protection Program. This is the program for small business forgivable loans for companies under 500 employees that Congress has spent about $500 billion. There's about another $100 billion or so left in the program. This program was created to help companies pay their bills during the lockdowns, and particularly to pay their staff. But a number of industries have found that cumbersome. Their bills are really more in their rent and overhead than in staff costs. Restaurants in particular complained that the program was not well designed for them. And so the House is going to vote this week to make it more flexible. There seems to be bipartisan support for that. The bill has bipartisan sponsorship. And it will then go back to the Senate, where it seems like there is more or less agreement on making some sort of change to the Paycheck Protection Program. They'll have to work out the details. There seems to be some differences over the details, but we expect that there will reach some sort of agreement on that. In the weeks ahead, Speaker Pelosi says you can expect action on some of the routine business that Congress does. The defense authorization should get moving, as well as the appropriations process for fiscal 2021. She also indicated in a press briefing last week that they'll be looking at an infrastructure bill. And she said in particular with regard to that they would be looking to give money to the Postal Service, which has been badly hurt by the virus and a decline in first-class mail, with funding to help upgrade its infrastructure, its technology, which is out of date. Of course, the Postal Service has had economic problems for some years now. It's been losing billions of dollars. Part of that is a requirement that they pre-fund pension costs. But we'll be looking forward to see what's in that proposal. At the same time, the House is still a bit hamstrung. The rule change that they passed on proxy voting also allows committee markups to resume, but only after each committee has held a couple hearings as well as a practice markup session. And this is if they want to conduct a markup virtually. Of course, they can continue to conduct markups in person, but to use video technology, they'll have to have conducted 2 hearings as well as a practice session. So we won't see markups resume in any sort of normal way, at least in the next few weeks, it would seem. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions to our 3 panelists. Folks, do you have any queries about what the House is up to?
Well, Sean, this is Neil Slisnewski. If I may begin, ask you, what do you think is, now obviously they're waiting for the Senate, and we'll get to that when I speak in a few minutes, but do you think that there's any likelihood that that this is the end of the House's business on the coronavirus response? That what's the likelihood that this is sort of the final offer, or do you think that there may be more packages still to come?
Yeah, well, on May 15th, in addition to passing that proxy voting rule change, of course, the House passed the HEROES Act. It's $3 trillion offer to continue helping the American people who are weathering this crisis. And it was declared a non-starter in the Senate, as you well know. But Speaker Pelosi has made it abundantly clear, she said repeatedly, that this was an initial offer, that they're willing to bargain, they're willing to go to the table. And I expect that there will be another rescue package coming out of the House, definitely. There seems to be room for agreement around aid to states and localities who've been battered by a decline in tax revenue, as well as a need to help Americans out of work. There's going to be a lot of negotiating that will have to happen around that. Republicans aren't keen on extending the pandemic employment emergency compensation program. This is the extra $600 a week in employment benefits that the federal government is providing through the end of July. Republicans aren't keen on that because they feel it's preventing people from going back to work, that they're making too much money staying at home. But there is a proposal on the table, which maybe you'll get to in more detail later, that would instead provide a bonus for people from the federal government for people who are going back to work, that they would get a little plus up on their paycheck from the federal government. So I think we'll see more negotiating starting probably when the Senate gets back next week over the following few weeks. And with some of these major programs, the unemployment program and the Paycheck Protection Program expiring this summer, I expect there'll be a need for another bill. Mel or Jen, do you have any questions on the House?
Sean, yeah, this is Mary Ellen. How much do you expect that lawmakers are going to take advantage of this new rule allowing for proxy voting? Republicans, of course, were almost entirely united against it. What do you expect the usage to look like starting today and into the coming weeks?
Well, the Republicans have also filed a lawsuit yesterday to block the use of proxy voting. And that's not expected to affect the votes this week, but it casts a shadow over it, because if the House is to pass legislation and a court were to later rule that the proxy voting is unconstitutional, in that there is not a quorum of members on the floor, it could throw into havoc that legislation. There's even the possibility that Senator McConnell could ignore this House-passed legislation, fearing that it could be thrown out later by a court. But from what I understand, the number of members requesting proxy voting privileges is about 40 or so, and that would not preclude a quorum, which is more than half of the members, from actually voting in person. So it remains to be seen, of course, how the courts will see this. They've typically been deferential to the House and Senate in setting their own rules, but it remains to be seen. But I think another factor is whether an actual quorum of 218 or so representatives comes to vote in person. If they do, it could make this problem of constitutionality much less of one for the House. Jen, do you have an inquiry?
Yeah, can you give us your take on what the House is going to do on sort of its annual legislation that it always has to work through, the defense authorization bill, the appropriations bills, and how do you see these markups going in the age of coronavirus?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see a big slowdown in the typical workload of the House, because the members are reluctant, a lot of the members are reluctant to come back to Washington to crowd into hearing rooms and to conduct hearings and markups. And even this new rule change would require that, as I mentioned, a practice session for a markup, as well as 2 hearings before a committee could begin marking up legislation virtually. So I think it's going to be a slow process. We're going to see a lot less legislation move through the House for the rest of the year. But I do think they are going to do those 2 things for sure. The defense authorization, which Congress has passed every year going back many decades. I don't think they're going to let that slip. And the appropriations, of course, they need to fund the government for fiscal 21, and I expect they will, but it will be a slow process. Let's go to Niels now. He's going to give us a briefing on the Senate.
Yes, thank you, and thanks to everyone who is joining us this morning. The Senate has continued to focus its attention on nominations more than anything else. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has said repeatedly that they are open to doing more relief legislation. He said just yesterday in events both in Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky, that there certainly likely will be a narrowly tailored additional coronavirus relief package that he wants to see feature liability protection for businesses and probably doctors and medical professionals from coronavirus-related liability as the economy continues to reopen. But beyond that, it's anybody's guess how much legislating the Senate actually does. The schedule, I could read off a long list of judicial nominations that are pending for floor consideration, but I'll only mention one here, which is Justin Walker, who is actually from Louisville, Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's hometown. He is nominated to a seat on the Circuit Court of Appeals here in the District of Columbia. I expect that to be really the Senate's top priority of the next couple of weeks. But also the defense authorization, the Senate Armed Services Committee has announced a markup schedule starting in about 2 weeks from now. And that I expect will probably be on the floor this coming work period. That's what McConnell has indicated. That is important because the one thing I will add is that could also be the venue for some sort of a response to China in connection to COVID-19. There has been talk that that could be the vehicle for either a sanctions measure or some sort of other rebuttal to China by Senate Republicans. So that would be one piece I would be looking at. And the last thing that I would mention in terms of the Senate agenda is that they are still obviously trying to figure out how to get that expansion or extension rather of the Paycheck Protection Program, that Small Business Administration program. That extension still needs to move through. So that is another item that I think they want to try and get done during the pro forma sessions this week. But again, this could be complicated. So that's that. I'll take, if my colleagues have any questions on what the Senate's up to, or maybe the White House as well, I am welcome to take those.
Hey, Neil, it's Sean. Why don't I kick off the questioning? I'm wondering, Senator McConnell was back in Kentucky yesterday, and he indicated that there's a possibility they'll move forward with a fifth relief bill. What did you read into that, and where do you see the potential for compromise on a fifth virus relief bill?
Well, the really interesting piece, and Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York is in D.C. Today. The really interesting piece is how they come up with the state and local aid expansion. Because McConnell insists that any sort of additional assistance to state and local governments not be for spending on pre-existing problems. So states that may have had revenue shortfalls or pension liabilities going out as far as the eye can see, McConnell says there is no appetite among Senate Republicans for addressing that sort of an issue. Obviously, the House Democrats seem to have a broader view of what exactly aid to states should look like. So I think there is going to be room to negotiate on that, because there are even some very red states or states that President Trump would like to be competitive in come November that are going to need aid, additional assistance as well, because as everybody knows, particularly in states where you're really dependent on sales taxes or on hotel taxes, meals taxes, the revenues have just fallen off the cliff because of the nobody is going to a hotel and paying the 13.5% tax or whatever it may be. So I think there's room to negotiate there. But it is going to be interesting to see how they come up with the process for determining what revenue was lost because of COVID-19 versus the issues that states are having in general that have unmet pension liabilities and the like.
Thanks, Niels. Jen or Mel, do you have a question?
Niels, it's Mel. Can you talk a little bit about this liability bill that Senator Cornyn is working on? Senator McConnell has, of course, said that this is a top priority for Republicans going forward. Are Democrats open to this? What do we expect this bill to look like? When might we see it?
Well, thanks for that question. Cornyn used to be a member of leadership, of course, and so we have a situation where, because he used to be in the leadership, he's been delegated as McConnell's designee to basically come up with this legislation. I am certainly thinking that they're going to come up with this sooner rather than later. I would expect it shortly after the Senate gets back into town, at least the first version of that proposal. This is something that would normally go through the Judiciary Committee, where Cornyn is a senior member. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they sort of moved ahead quickly there. But the question is whether or not McConnell intends to move it to the floor at any point in the near future. And frankly, I don't know the answer to that question because if, for lack of a better term, they don't necessarily have a vehicle to go with, because they're working on nominations and because they are dealing more broadly with the defense authorization and other matters. I don't know that McConnell will put that on the floor until there is something that is actually moving ahead.
Hey, Niels, it's Jen. Can you talk to us about how the November elections are playing a part in coronavirus aid package talks? I know Senator Cory Gardner from Colorado and Senator Susan Collins from Maine have got in the last week a little bit more vocal about what they wanted to see in aid packages. So how are those, sort of at-risk Republicans playing a role in these talks?
Well, for one thing, it's interesting for Senator Gardner. He has to thread a needle of the fact that so many Republicans have decided to use marijuana policy as sort of a bludgeon against the House bill. As you know, Jen, and as many of our listeners probably do, with the legal cannabis business in Colorado and the issues accessing banking for cannabis businesses, that's been something that the House Democrats have tried to resolve in the coronavirus aid legislation. It's something that Senate Republicans, including McConnell and Todd Young, the chairman of the campaign committee, have criticized. So Gardner's in a particularly tough spot there. However, he did secure a commitment along with Steve Daines, Republican from Montana, to get floor time for a big package that would provide funding for national parks, as well as for the maintenance backlog there. And I think that's the other piece of this puzzle, is that the one thing that will be on the Senate floor is a large sort of Interior Department National Park Service investment package, which would be considered a stimulus package, particularly for Republicans who are up for re-election in Western states. And obviously, Martha McSally, we can't say she's up for re-election because she didn't win the seat the first time. But McSally is on the ballot, as well as Daines and Gardner.
Niels, we had an audience question that I wanted to ask you, which was where Democrats are. Do you think there's any possibility that Democrats might come around on the liability issue? They've been very critical of the Republicans for broaching that topic. But I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Well, Sean, that's an excellent question because it seems like they're going to have to come around, at least in some regard, if they want another package to get past Mitch McConnell. Uh, what I think is going to be key here is how narrowly defined liability related to COVID-19 is. So just a hypothetical example, but suppose you are a restaurant that reopens. Are you absolved if a breakout of positive cases emerges in your restaurant, just no matter what? Or are you only absolved if you are adhering to social distancing standards and you are making sure that there's abundant hand sanitizer and soap and you're cleaning things constantly? Sort of the question is, you know, frankly, we have all been to a bar or a restaurant in our lifetime in the previous to coronavirus era where the sanitation standards were probably not where they should be. And I guess the question probably will be is how broad is the liability protection if you weren't necessarily adhering to those sorts of standards even in the old world?
And Niels, on the issue of that Safe Banking Act, the marijuana provisions, the cannabis provisions, Senator McConnell indeed has mocked the House for including that bill in the HEROES Act. He said, for example, that the word cannabis appears more times than the word jobs. Fair to say that that bill is not going anywhere in the Senate in any sort of virus relief package.
You know, Sean, I think that is fair to say, although there is always the possibility that it moves in some other sort of legislation, because I'm not sure that there's political opposition to it, but I'm not sure how ardent the opposition is to it. When we get to our colleague Jennifer, she may have a little bit more to say on this, but it's the kind of thing that wouldn't surprise me if it at least tried to appear in some form in the appropriations process in that financial services and general government spending bill. But I will leave it to my colleague to say more if she has on that.
All right, with that, let's go to you, Jennifer Schutt, for a briefing on the fifth virus relief bill and where that's headed.
Hey, thanks, Sean. So conversations right now on the next relief bill are in their very preliminary stages. I think one of the things that might be pretty interesting as both chambers sort of head into next week when the Senate returns to Washington is how the Paycheck Protection Program and the fixes that it needs might drive another piece of legislation. We saw this with the fourth package, the most recent package that's passed into law, and obviously the Paycheck Protection Program, you know, very quickly running out of money and concerns that enough small businesses weren't getting access to that capital, really drove negotiations between Democrats and Republicans. And obviously, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer had a list of things they wanted in that bill, in addition to just adding, billions of additional dollars for the Paycheck Protection Program, that small business loan program. And so that ended up being, package 4, and that included, additional money for hospitals and healthcare providers, as well as, $25 billion for COVID-19 testing. And so I do think with the conversations that happened last week in the Senate between Senator Marco Rubio and Senator Ben Cardin on extending this amount of time from 8 weeks to 16 weeks, and I do think the House voting on a bill this week that would do that, extend that amount of time from 8 weeks to 24 weeks, as well as the other changes in that legislation. And the importance of that program right now for small businesses in pretty much every state throughout the country could really speed up and drive talks on a fifth aid package. So I think that's going to be the interesting thing to watch, you know, heading into next week and throughout the month of June. Obviously, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has not actually said definitively that he and Senate Republicans will enter bipartisan bicameral talks on another aid package. He has said things like likely and possibly and probably, but we haven't gotten the definitive, you know, thumbs up from him yet. And so obviously the Senate is on a break this week, and so he has been back in his home state of Kentucky. And so we're continuing to get those kind of lukewarm signals from McConnell this week. He, of course, is very focused on if there is another aid package, it will include liability protections. But at the University of Kentucky yesterday, he said that those wouldn't, quote, protect anyone from gross negligence or intentional misconduct. And so that is one of the things that we really know if he does officially enter these talks that he is going to insist on. And one of the really interesting things after kind of tracking the state and local aid issue is that he did say yesterday that it is a possibility. And so that was the first sort of indication that I've heard from him, at least, of him sort of opening the door to those conversations. So I think it's sort of reading the tea leaves with him at this point. But I really think that there is likely to be some type of negotiation or another aid package, although I don't think it's going to be anywhere close to looking like what House Democrats did with that $3 trillion HEROES Act that they passed earlier this month. We saw 14 House Democrats vote against that spending bill. Most of them were moderates who were a little bit frustrated that it wasn't bipartisan in nature. And so if you look through the various elements of that bill, there are a lot of them. There are some elements that are likely to gain bipartisan traction in future negotiations, but I think there's a lot of them that were just sort of Democrats adding items to kind of a dream bill. And another thing that we've been watching and kind of projecting what might be on the next aid package is conversations out of the White House. Obviously, the Trump administration would be involved in any negotiations on another, you know, multi-billion-dollar aid package. And one thing that we heard yesterday that was pretty interesting from White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow, he was speaking on Fox News, and he referenced a proposal from Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman that would provide about $450 per week as an incentive for people to return to work. And I think that is something that's going to be really central in these packages going forward, because one of the things that we know is that $600 plus up for unemployment insurance benefits that was passed in March, and that $3 trillion aid package is set to expire this summer. And we know that a lot of Republicans are concerned about that because in some situations, it might mean that people going back to work technically get a reduction in pay. So it sounds like Republicans are trying to work out a proposal right now that would sort of not necessarily replace that. That would not be the correct way to say that, but kind of, you know, a way to continue to provide people a little bit of additional funding as they, you know, sort of head back to work while these coronavirus cases are still around, obviously, and there's no vaccine yet. So that is basically where we are on the next aid package.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. There was another bipartisan piece of the HEROES Act, and I'm wondering what your assessment of it is. It was sponsored by Stephanie Murphy, who's the co-chair of the Blue Dog Coalition, the moderate Democratic caucus, but also Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican in Pennsylvania, John Katko, a Republican from New York, that would increase a tax credit that was in the CARES Act, the virus relief bill that passed at the end of March. And it's a tax credit that basically would help companies pay their workers. If you kept workers on the payroll, you'd get some of the money back. And in the CARES Act, I believe it was $5,000, so a fairly small amount of money per worker. But Murphy and her co-sponsors want to increase that to $45,000. It would be more along the lines of what they're doing in Europe, basically, of partially paying the salaries of employees if employers agree to keep them on. And it's appealing to businesses in that once the economy reopens, they won't have to rehire and retrain people. They'll stay connected to their workforce. Do you see any potential for that in the Senate?
I do see potential, not necessarily for that proposal individually, but for an element in the fifth aid package that really focuses on encouraging people to go back to work. This is something we've heard from Republicans is a pretty big concern of theirs, that people are going to want to stay home a little bit longer or be more hesitant about going back to work. And I think some of those concerns are financial. Obviously, a lot of people do need to go back to work. And I think some of those concerns are health-wise as well. Obviously, if you are a person with a pre-existing condition or, a parent with young children at home who's concerned about, being out among, people all day and potentially getting infected and bringing that back home pre-vaccine, I think there's a lot of concerns like that floating around. So I think there's a lot of interest on the Hill about coming up with proposals that really incentivize people going back to work right now when there is still an enhanced risk that they catch COVID-19.
All right, why don't we go to Mel now, Mary Ellen, for a report on health so that we have enough time here to answer some of the many good questions coming in from our audience. So Mel, could you give your health briefing?
Sure thing, Sean. Thanks everyone for joining this morning. Just kind of to set the scene here, I think one of the most striking things to me in covering the federal government's response to this pandemic is that often with public health crises or emergencies, we sort of see some level of bipartisanship. When you're thinking about funding or whatever, there might be some partisan differences, but the response to this pandemic as it has gone on we've really seen more and more of a partisan response, which is something that's been very striking to me, having covered, other public health crises before. Testing has, of course, been, one of the biggest challenges for the U.S. in scaling up its response to COVID-19. In recent weeks, the U.S. has really gotten to the point that we're now conducting more than 300,000 coronavirus tests per day, sometimes reaching 400,000. And we're hitting that pretty regularly. That's a number that the administration said in the testing strategy report that it released to Congress over the weekend, said that it is roughly where the U.S. should be. They said that they expect that to continue increasing in the coming months. What they're saying is that all states should be testing 1 to 2% of their population this month and next, and that the goal is for the positivity rate to be less than 10%. So that means you're having, of all the tests that you're doing, less than 10% of them are coming back positive is sort of where they're saying you want to be. Experts are still saying that more testing is necessary, and there's a lot of discussion about how best to continue ramping up testing and how to deploy the testing that we have available and will have available in the future as people begin to return to work this fall, return to school. Colleges and universities are, coming up with plans for how they plan to have students back on campus this fall. So looking at that is something that will continue to be an issue in the coming months into the summer. And this is something that the administration has said states should really be leading on. So they're saying we will guide you, we will have, try to continue helping to facilitate more tests and testing supplies, but states really need to be leading the way on their plans here. One thing that in that report that I mentioned, the administration did say is that they're going to begin stockpiling tests and testing supplies in the National Strategic Stockpile. So that could be something that states could turn to in the future if they need more supplies. One of the challenges, as many of you will remember in recent months, is that, states were turning to, different options, saying they were competing with each other to get tests and testing supplies. Maryland went to South Korea. Massachusetts turned to Patriots owner Bob Kraft. I know that because I'm a massive Patriots fan. So, looking at some of these things, having them in the stockpile could be a good option for states, particularly if we do see that second wave that many experts are predicting later this year. The other thing that the administration has been focusing on a lot in the last couple of weeks is developing a vaccine. They have announced this goal of having a vaccine, the first options available as soon as the end of this year. So that's something that the administration is really focusing on. They've brought in a new vaccine czar, someone to help facilitate all of this, and the government has begun to distribute funds to some pharmaceutical companies to help with the development of the vaccine. So, they're really looking for vaccines to be in stage 3 clinical trials this summer, hopefully sometime by fall, they're saying, having the first millions of doses available to start to deploy them. Of course, there's going to be some challenges with that. Deploying this vaccine, making it available and accessible to people is going to be a huge undertaking. This is something that's going to be, really a lot of focus on having this both in the US and worldwide. There's already discussion about, okay, do we make this vaccine available first to healthcare providers and other frontline workers who are most at risk? What's sort of the strategy for making this available and for making sure that you have the means to distribute it across the country? Another concern as the vaccine, as a vaccine becomes available, you're already seeing progressive groups really pushing to say, we need to make sure that this is price accessible and affordable for people. And this is something that came up a few months ago when Congress first started focusing on the coronavirus. But you'll continue to see this. This is something that progressive lawmakers are continuing to raise. They want in a future pandemic response package, guarantees that this will be affordable, if not free, for people, and that you'll be able to see how much the government is putting into an eventual vaccine, because Congress has allocated funding to go towards a vaccine that is going to these drug companies. There's also could be concerns about whether or not there would be concern about taking this vaccine. Obviously, this would be a vaccine that's coming together more quickly than any vaccine in the past. There's definitely some skepticism amongst experts about whether or not it's possible to have a vaccine together this fast. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Disease, has said 12 to 18 months, and that would be a record. So what sort of anti-vax concerns are there and might there be in terms of long-term side effects and concerns about a future vaccine? And pretty much every state in the country has now started to say we're beginning to lift some restrictions going into, their first phases of reopening. Experts predict that you will start to see some cases going up, and in some states you have seen the case numbers beginning to increase. So this is something that to continue to keep an eye on. Of course, epidemiologists and public health experts are, encouraging the use of wearing masks, continuing social distancing. Kind of like I said earlier, of course, the mask issue, some of these public health issues have taken on a bit of a partisan tilt. So it could be difficult to see how this goes going forward. And especially as we get more into the summer months, I'm sure we all saw photos of, places being opened over the holiday weekend this past weekend. And, maybe it'll be interesting to see how people continue to social distance as the summer progresses.
Mel, a question from our audience. One of the solutions that the epidemiologists, the public health experts have said is crucial is not only testing, but tracking and tracing, the contacts of people who test positive for the virus. Is the federal government doing anything in that regard? We've heard the states, a number of states are hiring people to do this tracing work. We've heard universities say that tracing will be part of their reopening. The president of Notre Dame, for example, the president of Purdue have said they will be doing that on their campuses when they reopen in the fall. But is the federal government taking any leadership there or providing funds to help with the tracing?
So Congress has provided funding for testing that could also go towards contact tracing. But yes, this is something that we're really seeing the states begin to focus on. You have also heard some things about the development of an app and allowing for apps to follow, people to download an app that would then, inform them of whether or not they've been exposed to the coronavirus. So yeah, contact tracing is very important. It's something that at this point in time, states are really leading, but experts do say that the CDC should be working more hand in glove with the states on this.
Another question for you, Mel, from the audience. I know you've covered this issue and are well briefed on it, but surprise medical billing. This was thought at the beginning of the year to be an area where there was potential for a deal between the House and Senate, between Democrats and Republicans. Is it going to happen, or is the virus just too much of a focus right now?
So like you said, so I mean, surprise medical billing is something that lawmakers have been, focused on for over a year now, trying to get this over the finish line. And the administration has taken steps in terms of surprise medical billing to try to ensure that patients who are getting care for coronavirus won't get surprise medical bills. Since this is a pandemic, they've taken steps to make sure that uninsured patients won't face extra costs for coronavirus care. They've also said that, hospitals won't get coronavirus funding if they are sending surprise medical bills. The legislation that Health Committee Chairman Senator Lamar Alexander and Energy and Commerce Committee Chairman Frank Pallone have put forward and been working on in terms of surprise medical billing is something that Republicans on those two committees have really been pushing to include in the last few coronavirus response packages. At this point, I would say that they are continuing to push for inclusion in, a possible fifth package, but it hasn't been included yet. There's a lot of lobbying going on within the healthcare industry and all of these bills trying to make sure that, hospitals and healthcare systems are getting the funding that they need to stay afloat during this pandemic. You have health insurers who are starting to say, okay, we need to make sure that people are keeping their insurance and that we won't have to raise our premiums next year. So the lobbying that you've seen behind the scenes between these two groups on the surprise medical billing issue is now they're both also pushing for, their priorities as Congress responds to these issues. So it may be difficult to see exactly how some of these surprise billing provisions end up in a final bill.
Okay, another question from our audience. I want to direct this to you, Jennifer Schutt. The Postal Service is hurting badly because of the decline in first-class mail stemming from the virus and the associated lockdowns. In the HEROES Act that the House passed this month, they would provide, I think, $25 billion, what the Postal Service says it needs to get it through. But President Trump has said that he wants to see some changes made at the Postal Service. He wants to see them charge more for parcels, for example. He thinks they're giving too good a deal to companies like Amazon. And that kind of clouds the picture so far as whether there might be Republican support for bailing out the Postal Service. So where do you see that debate headed?
I think that debate is likely to take place in the context of the fifth aid package, but I don't know that it necessarily will end up in the final legislation. The Postal Service is one of those sort of policy areas that President Trump has has sort of grabbed onto for one reason or another. And I think that it is something that Democrats are going to continue pushing, and it's obviously something that a lot of people who represent rural areas have an interest in continuing to survive, essentially. But I don't know how much bipartisan support there will be to providing additional aid to the Postal Service in a relief bill. And so I think that's something that we're going to be keeping a very close eye on. But I don't think there's been very clear signals yet from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell or from House GOP Leader Kevin McCarthy about where they may go in negotiations on this. So all we've really had is kind of Trump sort of airing his frustration with how the Postal Service treats companies like Amazon.
All right, another question for you, Jen, from our audience about the appropriations timeline. We've gotten inklings that it's going to get rolling again, but also it seems like it can't proceed on the normal timeline. So what are you hearing so far as fiscal 2021 appropriations bills?
So one of the really big advantages to the fiscal 21 process, which we are sort of strangely in the middle of right now, is that the House Appropriations Committee and Senate Appropriations Committee does have their top line, that total amount of money that they can spend on all 12 annual spending bills. And so that is something that, if you think back to last summer, we didn't get until just ahead of the August recess. And so if you remember last year during the August recess, the Senate Appropriations Committee was handing out their subcommittee allocations to all 12 subcommittees. They were drafting the legislation, and then Senate Appropes was marking up in September. And so for Senate Appropes this year, they might still be a little bit ahead of their timeline from last year. We know that this week, the Senate is on its week-long Memorial Day break, but heading into that, Senate Appropriations Chairman Richard Shelby told a few of us that he's planning to send those subcommittee allocations to his chairman this week. And so it seems likely that the first couple weeks of June, the Senate Appropriations Committee staff and lawmakers will be drafting their legislation. Right now, the Senate Appropriations Committee hopes to begin markups that third week of June. And if you look at the way the Senate calendar is structured right now, there is a possibility that they mark up all the bills they're planning to before the 4th of July recess. And I say all the bills they're planning to because for those of you who have been following every twist and turn of this year like I have, there's a possibility that in the Senate, military construction VA and Homeland Security do not get marked up because of the various political and policy issues in those bills, but that is not a certainty at this point in time. Over on the House side, the timeline is a little less structured at this point in time. The committee is saying that it wants to hold off on marking up its annual spending bills until after the House and Senate and Trump administration reach agreement on this next coronavirus aid package. We don't necessarily know if that will hold, if these conversations on a fifth relief bill slide into late June and look like they're going to go into July. I think it's likely that House Appropriations tries to juggle a lot of things at once because obviously their staff and Chairwoman Nita Lowey and Ranking Member Kay Granger are pretty instrumental in these aid package talks just because it's their spending bills, right? There's a huge appropriations component here. And so the House Appropriations Committee schedule is a little bit less formed up right now than the Senate is, but I do think it's likely that they do start marking up later in June or in July. I do know that House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer really wants to get floor debate on these. He's still very hopeful for June, although I am highly skeptical of House floor debate on any appropriations bills for fiscal 21 in June. And so that is where we're at right now on fiscal 2021. Although I will say that pretty much every year I do expect us to start the beginning of the fiscal year on October 1st with a continuing resolution.
Thanks for that, Jen. Okay, Niels, question for you on the Senate. Senator McConnell has indicated he may be flexible on providing some aid to states. Now, Senator McConnell, people will recall, is resisting further aid to states. He says they've already given them $150 billion. He says that blue states, Democratic states, many of them have mismanaged their pensions and therefore were in a financial bind prior to the virus situation. And so he's been reluctant. Given that, would we expect that the aid that might come to states, if further aid comes, will come with some sort of stipulations on how it's used?
Well, Sean, yes, I think it's certainly true that there would be some kind of stipulation that it be directly related to the expenses that were incurred or the lost revenues that came about from the coronavirus. But part of what may also come into this and will probably be part of these negotiations is what exactly is the enforcement mechanism if a state apply. So suppose they impose these restrictions, but it's left up to, say, Stephen Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, to make the determination as to whether or not a state is in compliance. The risk here is trying to avoid a political situation where essentially red states would be allowed to spend money on whatever they want, and New York or New Jersey or another blue state is subject to some sort of onerous reporting requirement or restrictions or running the risk of having funds pulled back. It's going to be really tricky to come up with a system that Senate Republicans, House Democrats, the Treasury Department presumably could agree on how to dispense the money in a way that no one is worried about states that are blue states facing restrictions that red states don't have.
Niels, one more question for you from our audience. We have time, I think, just for one more, unfortunately. We have a lot of good questions, and thank you so much for submitting them, and our apologies for not being able to get to them all. But this last one goes to you, Niels. There's bipartisan support for some sort of overhaul of the Paycheck Protection Program to make it more flexible in how the money is used and how long small companies have to use it. We expect the House will pass that bill this week. Could the Senate also pass it this week? Could they wave it through while they're out of town by unanimous consent? Or is there likely to be a need for some sort of negotiation?
You know, we thought that there would not need to be a negotiation. We were all sort of waiting last Thursday for an agreement in the Senate to move forward full speed ahead. That was what Senator Marco Rubio, the chairman of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee, was thinking was going to happen, and it didn't happen. I would anticipate that they could at least get it done the first day they come back officially, which is next Monday afternoon. But it wouldn't surprise me if it got done this week, but it also wouldn't surprise me if it did not get done this week because of, frankly, there are so many senators who have their own ideas about what should be going on that it feels like the kind of thing that could be become unwieldy for no good reason, really. And so it wouldn't surprise me if it was held off until next Monday.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Niels, and thank you, all three of you, for your insights today. This has been a great conversation, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Jennifer, Niels, and Mary Ellen for taking the time to participate today. And I'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining us. We really appreciate it. We know your time is valuable, and we're thankful that you spent some of it with us. For more of these sorts of insights, please, again, visit rollcall.com, our podcast page, where you can find free links to our daily CQ on Congress Coronavirus Special Report podcast, as well as the CQ Budget podcast, where Jennifer Schutt is a host, and our Political Theater podcast, where you will hear much of the same. As a follow-up, we'll be sending out the recording of today's webinar. And if you'd like to learn more about FiscalNote, CQ Roll Call's parent company, and how it can help your organization monitor the politics and policy around COVID-19, please visit coronavirus.fiscalnote.com. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.